Hello, my name is Kimiko Nagasawa. Today, our presentation title is Supporting Senior Survivors, the Necessity of Trauma-Informed Care in Social Work for TGE Japan. In a presentation, I use the word transgender to mean TGE, which stands for transgender and gender expansive. Sorry. Yes. Our research team consists of 3 people. Hama, will you start, please? Who is an LGBTQ activist and counselor and was chosen as transgender community-based fellow last year. Kyoko Takeuchi is a sociologist and researcher of the history of trans non-binary activists in Japan. And I, Kimiko Nagasawa, work as a faculty of social work, and I'm researcher of queer social work. Hama and I have been working to help LGBTQIA people in our local area since 2017. And Hama wants to share his experiences as a transgender. Thank you. Hama wants to share his experiences as a transgender seniors in Japan with the world. And I, as Hama's partner, want to use their valuable experiences as a survivor in social work, education, and training. Our research and activities aims to heal all senior trans people, including those who have already passed away due to loss of health and income, whose voices has not been heard until now. The contents of the presentation is as follows. Firstly, I'd like to introduce the psychosocial situation of transgender people in Japan and argue the need to introduce trauma-informed social work to practice into education. Secondly, I'd like to describe the structure of trauma for senior trans men in Japan, drawing on Hama's case, for example. Finally, I would like to propose a law for social workers by referring to the concept of co-production and empowerment. In Japan, there are no official statistics on LGBTQIA. According to a rare nationwide survey by Kamano, the transgender population is estimated to be 0.6%. And from the perspective of psychosocial situation, I'd like to focus on 2 topics here, mental health and poverty, which is one of the most relevant to social work. In terms of mental health, transgender people are 5 times more likely to contemplate suicide and 10 times more likely to attempt suicide in the survey of Osaka residents. 1 in 4 people feel serious psychological distress, and percentage of transgender people who have daily difficulties in areas such as health, job, employment, and income is very high. It's about 1.5 to 2 times that of cisgender people. And then, in terms of poverty, during the coronavirus pandemic, 28.4% of trans men and 44.6% of trans women has an experience of having less than, say, 96 Canadian dollars. It means very poor in their bank accounts. According to other survey by Ishii, public assistance recipients of transgender are excluded from school education and employment system, and that is a cause of their poverty. In the fields of care and support for the disabled and the elderly, the gendered nature of the space, intersectionality are not taken into account, so it is not easy to be provided with care that in line with their gender identity. So why are social workers, we, in Japan, unable to respond appropriately to transgender clients? First of all, they have not learned about LGBTQIA or queer issues in their formal social work training curriculum. Secondly, they have little knowledge of gender in both compulsory education and professional training. Last but not least, social work professionals are usually unaware of the oppressive social structure and privilege they have and are not politically inclined. However, recent report in the UK indicates that even in the US, Canada, and Australia, there are not only an absence of transgender issues from social work education, but also reluctance among academic faculties to cover transphobia. So therefore, this is a problem that is shared across the world in social work education. So as a faculty that trains social work professionals who can respond to LGBTQIA needs, we argue that introduced trauma-informed social work into education is necessary. Let's start by clarifying the definition. Trauma-informed social work is defined as follows: to address the needs of individual families and communities, increasingly exposed to toxic and traumatic stress, and confront issues involving justice and seeking protection against further harm. So trauma-informed care or social work is important for the following two reasons. One reason is that because traumatization or re-traumatization can be perpetuated intentionally and unintentionally. Another reason is related to coming out. In our country, according to survey result, 1 in 6 transgender people will come out to their workplace or those around them. Of these, proportion who come out to medical care or social work professional is even lower. Healthcare and social care professionals need to provide care in situations without knowing who is transgender. So LGBTQ people hold back for fear of discriminative treatment in social care and healthcare setting. And social workers must be ready to serve clients who haven't come out yet. So trauma-informed social work must take into account in the complex experience of transgender people living in various regions and generations. So what kind of life trajectory has the senior trans man experienced? I'd like to share Hama's case. Not all senior trans men have had the same experience as him, but it will help us understand what people of his age in Japan have experienced. In 1980s, in the 20s, Hama worked at what is known as Onabe Bar, which is night bar, where trans men worked at. One of his colleagues died of alcoholism, and another died of gynecological diseases. Neither wanted to go to hospital for checkup and have their body examined. In 1990s, in their 30s, trans men like Hama find a place in the lesbian community, but also exclusion there because they are expressing themselves in a masculine way. As the transgender community emerged in the mid-90s in Japan, there was no place for them to belong to other than lesbian community. Next. 2000. In their 40s. 2003, in Japan, GID legislation, which allows gender transition through gender-affirming surgery, came into effect. But Hama felt discomfort with the binary transition. Because GID based on the medical model became well-known in Japan, he feels that trans people who have not had surgery have been forgotten by society. Instead, he has long periods questioning his gender identity while remaining unknown to society. They are traumatized by long experience being oppressed by the powerful social norm, gender binary, cisgenderism, and hierarchy symbolized by patriarchy in that era. So according to queer social work literature, the structure of trauma can be organized in 3 aspects: direct trauma, indirect trauma, and insidious trauma. Citing the definition of feminist psychologist Maria Root, insidious trauma means ongoing experiences of oppression and discrimination directed at transgender people and its psychological effects on them. The trauma that trans men like Hama experienced throughout his life can be called insidious trauma, which includes microaggressions. It can also be said insidious trauma is generated from epistemic injustice. According to Miranda Flicker, epistemic injustice is composed of two types of injustice. One is hermeneutical injustice, another is testimonial injustice. In Hammer's narrative, hermeneutical injustice means there was no word or concept of transgender or gender identity at that time. So for him, there are no narratives that describe themselves. And testimonial injustice means their voice is never heard in cisgenderism. And also healthcare and social care professionals, including social workers, have turned a blind eye to this injustice. Hammer once said, showing his anger, "Give me back my life." The occurrence of anger is related to perception judgment, related to social norms such as something being treated unfairly, which can be rephrased to argue that epistemic injustice continues. It is also said that anger and trauma are deeply connected. Anger is like a shield to protect oneself from society. To release your anger should be acknowledged and shared in a safe place. So how should social work respond to the trauma of the seniors caused of this injustice? I argue that one of the important social work responsibilities and roles is to uncover and generate diverse narratives to account for intersectionality among transgender people. Those narratives must be created by co-production with trans seniors in a safe place. As a profession that protects trans rights, we social workers are required to heal and empower trans seniors who have not created their narratives and pass on their experiences to the younger generation and have them acknowledged by society. For example, thanks to Aaron, Michael, Spencer, and Jay, we tried to create a space at University Victoria here to formulate verbal and non-verbal narratives with Hama, Kyoko, Sonia 2 days ago, as these flyers show. And as a faculty member representing a Department of Social Work, I would like to develop education that uncover trans narratives. Is there any example good educational practice in your country or area? I'd be grateful if you could share them with us. So thank you for listening. I welcome any question you may have, and if you're interested in Hammer's narrative, please ask Hammer the question. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Elio, and I just want to start by acknowledging that I live and work in Choquette, also called Muniyang, and the unceded traditional territories of the Genyan Gahaga. I find it important to acknowledge because when I talk about inclusive design, inclusive design is and just diversity, inclusion are colonial concepts that predate by far colonialism. So a little bit about me. I'm a bilingual, disabled, queer, and trans person. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an architect and consultant in universal and inclusive design, as well as an artist and a writer. So I'm passionate about queer joy, but I'm also really passionate about accessibility and approaching architecture and the built environment from the user's perspective, and how our intersecting identities impact the way we move through space, and in general, how architecture could learn and grow by using queer liberation as a new framework. So yeah, here. My presentation's main goal is first to offer an opportunity for reflection on how to shift how we think about accessibility and inclusion, and how to make them lenses through which we design instead of as afterthoughts, as is almost always the case in current architectural practices. And second, how we can then learn to design an undesigned space differently on how a sustainable architecture is also an inclusive one. So I first want to touch on what I mean by queer and queered space. For the past 7 years, I've been interested in what I call a queering of architecture. So for me, a queer space is a space that's either physically or virtually occupied by queer people. For example, a queer space could be a venue, such as an art gallery, a performing arts hall, a conference that presents the work of 2S LGBTQIA plus people. A queer space is one that is in reaction to the status quo, to society's normative standards. Chapter of the queer liberation movement targeted architecture specifically. So, for example, a queered space could be an exclusive, safer space for queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color that therefore is only accessible for people who identify as both queer and trans and Black, Indigenous, or people of color. A queer space could also be an inclusive washroom or any kind of facility that has been planned with inclusive design in mind. Protest could also create a moving queered space. So queer space, a space where queer people exist. Queer space, a space that challenges the norm and focuses on accessibility and inclusion. So a few examples of queered architecture that I find quite compelling. The first one is a really interesting structure called the Blur Building, which was designed by New York-based architecture firm Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro for the 2002 Swiss Expo. In the architect's words, the Blur Building was conceived to be out of focus, a response to the oversaturation of visual media. High definition had become the new religion, and by contrast, Blur's foggy environment was low definition, an architecture of atmosphere. So the platform created a microenvironment that offered nothing to see or do but contemplate our dependence on vision. Fresh water was pumped, filtered, and shot as a fine mist, and the resulting fog changed from season to season, day to day, even hour to hour, in a dynamic display of nature versus man-made. But what was particularly interesting in the Blur Building was that it was paired with another experiment called Braincoat. So the Blur Building's fog, by design, produces a kind of anonymity. It's difficult to distinguish individual features and people when you're walking through it. So Braincoat is an experiment of interpersonal communication within a space where your perception is compromised. Vision is blurred by the fog and hearing is dulled by the white noise of water. Braincoat doesn't rely on language, either written or spoken. So the project brings the notion of proxy communications, like some kind of telecommunication network. The Braincoat, a raincoat with technologies built into it, allows visitor to gain a sixth sense, or like a social radar. Basically, each visitor fills a questionnaire to produce a profile that is added to a database. Each visitor is then issued a Braincoat that includes an imprint of their profile, enabling the codes to communicate with one another. Visitors' answers are compared and evaluated by establishing correlations and connections. The Braincoats have the capacity to display three types of response: visual, so the codes change color based on affinity, a bit like blushing; acoustic, pulse that only the wearer can hear; and tactile, so when two people have 100% anonymous affinity, which was really rare, a small pad like a pager would vibrate in your rear pocket. So for me, this is a great example of queered architecture, of how to subvert what makes a building, and how we navigate through it. But mostly when I was reading about this experiment, I couldn't help but relate it to my experience as a trans and disabled person, about the soul solidarity that happens when we find each other, usually visually, in a space, and the way it impacts how safe and seen we feel when we navigate it. And also the isolation and loneliness that comes when those people are absent, either due to lack of access, representation, or simply fear. Another example of queer architecture that I find really interesting is an older utopian reflection on flexible space by visual artist Constant in a project he named New Babylon. New Babylon is an anti-capitalist city, a series of transformable structures that are interlinked to form a megastructure. The structure itself covers the cities below it in order to create an ever-changing playground above them, where humans can exist and do whatever, whenever, however they want, liberated from productivity and power-driven economical and political imperatives in order to fulfill their full potential. So New Babylon was based on the idea that architecture could initiate an allow transformation of daily reality by creating an opportunity for its users to explore, create, and recreate their environment at will according to their needs. It's a great example of an architecture without architects, the best architecture that exists by and for the people that live and exist in it, adaptable through time and space to their changing needs. It's also a great example of inclusive design and what I call undesigning. So I've mentioned a few times inclusive design. I think it's important to define some more general terms that relate to accessibility. I like to divide accessibility in 4 categories: adaptation, accessibility, universal design, and inclusive design. So adaptation would be a one-time solution, usually tailored to a person's or a group's specific needs, like changing existing spaces to make them accessible to one person or a group who wouldn't have been able to access them. Like if an office only has someone who is non-binary and now they have to create maybe a non-gendered washroom. Accessibility is the design of products, devices, services, and environments for people who experience disabilities. It also refers to the minimum requirement applicable to all buildings that allow a wheelchair user to access them. Universal accessibility, as outlined by codes, standards, and bylaws, is generally not enough and only covers the basic needs of a very small number of people with functional limitations. For example, neurodivergent and invisible disabilities are rarely taken into account in codes and standards. Universal design, on the other hand, is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, regardless of age, ability, and capacities, without the help of another person, the need for adaptation, or specialized design. We can usually organize or categorize universal design under 7 principles. So equitable use, flexibility in use, simple, intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. So all these principles mean that I could go on and on about examples, but we are limited by time. And finally, I will just mention that inclusive design is very similar to universal design, but with a specific emphasis on people of all gender identities, sexual orientations, cultural backgrounds, and social status. Inclusive design proposes a reflection on how each potential user navigates and moves through a space. There is, however, no one-size-fits-all. When talking about accessibility, inclusive design, it's impossible to create a space that will take into account the needs of every single person at all times. Sometimes the needs of some people are in direct conflict with the needs of others. For example, blind and visually impaired people might need very well-lit spaces with high contrast, and this kind of space can be really hard to navigate with people with light sensitivity or certain types of neurodivergences. So I talk about these 2 things, queer architecture and inclusive design, as lenses instead of afterthoughts, as a way to challenge the way a building is usually designed, linearly, only involving stakeholders and consultants, other experts when the architects deem them necessary. Oops. Thankfully, what we call integrated design is more and more common. Integrated design is a sustainable approach that aims to include architects, designers, engineers, consultants, clients, users, sometimes even city planners and citizens from the start of the design process, instead of as it progresses. It's a great approach, but it usually focuses on sustainability and doesn't necessarily regard accessibility and inclusion as important characteristics. Which is something I want to challenge, as many disability activists do. So at this point, it's important for me to talk about ageism and, sorry, I wrote capacitism as a wrong translation, so ableism. No matter our current status and ability, as we age and are exposed to a growing number of illnesses, new materials, technologies, and a rapidly changing and evolving climate crisis, we'll all eventually become disabled. It's not a matter of if, but when. Which is why it's important to build infrastructure that can adapt, not only to our current aging population, but for future ones as well. Safety and security are also very critical issues for gender diverse and disabled people alike. as well as many other minorities and marginalized groups, not only in terms of access, but also in terms of systems in place. I will just go quicker on this. So yeah, so it's important to ask some questions when you design a space, and especially when you talk about safety and security, for whom? So are the safety security measures in place exclusionary or discriminatory? Do they prioritize the comfort of white and or cis and or straight and or neurotypical people? In case of emergency, who are the first responders? Is it the cops? And what are the systems, buttons, phones in place? Are there security cameras? Yeah, so that leads me to one of my expertise, which is inclusive washroom and creating inclusive facilities. So for example, when designing inclusive washrooms, the issues of safety and security are often raised. There's been a lot of disinformation and misinformation about when talking about trans people in public washrooms, and a lot of people are concerned when mixed gender space are proposed. But inclusive washrooms propose a different kind of layout and design than the usual gendered washrooms. So since privacy is important, individual stalls are generally much more closed off than regular washrooms. So floor to ceiling partitions, stall doors with full coverage, so no spaces to really glance inside. The spaces where sinks and mirrors are is also usually very open and well lit with more than one entrances to avoid corners, dead ends, with no doors, making it more open, inviting, and public. And also, why do we need hand washing to be gendered? A good practice would also be to have a separate, fully accessible washroom, so a completely separate room. So people who require more space or privacy, and for people who just don't want to use the main space could use. So for me, this is an example of undesigning a way of doing something differently instead of trying to adapt existing systems and layouts to new needs. Inclusive washrooms designed like our usual gendered ones don't work, and we shouldn't try to make them work when there are other, better, new, more sustainable and efficient ways of doing them. This is partly what I mean when I'm talking about undesigning diversity and queering architecture. It's about systemic change and about finding new ways of navigating public spaces that are more inclusive, while also offering room for flexibility and growth. So I think that when we are talking about accessibility, inclusion, diversity, gender, and sustainability, we need to ask ourselves, how do we design spaces that can adapt to a fast-changing world, new technologies, unprecedented circumstances? How do we design for needs we can't even begin to imagine or understand yet? How can we prepare architecture and infrastructure for an increasingly uncertain, unpredictable future? And most importantly, how can we create resilient spaces and design that truly queered spaces that can transition over time? I obviously don't have all the answers, but I think that we can start answering these questions by designing spaces that are meant to offer safe access to as many people as possible, by centering marginalized voices and listening to their actual needs instead of deducing them, by going beyond codes and bylaws. True inclusion is not just superficial or about retrofitting. It's not just about changing signage, making non-gendered washrooms, ramps, elevators, wider doors, corridors, although these are all really good steps. True inclusion is about involving people with marginalized identities in the designing itself. It's about flexibility, making future adaptations easy, about planning a space for uses beyond what it's originally meant for, like making an office space that could be classrooms, student residences that could become family, or multi-generational housing. Houses that could be split in multiple units, buildings with mixity of uses, and by centering communities above all. So it doesn't even matter how we do it yet. It just matters that we start doing it.
Thank you all for joining us. I feel like my personal capacity for storing all the new information I'm learning today is reaching its limit. So thank you all. That said, I want to share with you the answer to a question that I ran into during some of my work of like, why do we even need a prescription in the first place? Why do we need to engage in these systems of care that aren't always situated to care for us in the way that we need to be cared for? So my main work that this stems from, thank you so much. is a 4.5-year-long ethnographic project on DIY HRT, or do-it-yourself hormone replacement therapy, wherein people find and access hormones outside of these systems of care. And in sort of wondering, like, okay, so why do people access hormones and care outside of, medical professionals? You go to the doctor, that sort of situation. And that led me to the question of, well, like, why is professional care even the default option? Why is that the enforced option, often legally? And I want today to focus specifically on why prescriptions. And I want to talk about specifically, like, why can't you walk into a 7-Eleven, pick up your chips, your toothpaste, your Tylenol, your vitamins, and your testosterone? Why is testosterone the weird one out on this list? Why is it not on the shelves? And when I talk about prescriptions, I really want to talk about that legally enforced relationship between a patient, a pharmacist, and a medical provider, where, you go visit someone with a specific degree and they write something on a specific type of piece of paper that you bring to a specific person at a store, and they can then give you a specific drug. Whereas for other drugs, you don't need to do any of that. And I want to start with the US-American War, and I'm going to talk about the US today. The UK and Canada have very analogous histories, but we only have time for one country today, and the US is perhaps the most impactful on the way other people regulate prescription products. So in the US-American War, US wanted a lot of land from Mexico, and they got it, but a lot of people died, and most people died actually from disease, not really from conflict. And that was from malaria, which is a parasite that's transmitted mostly by mosquitoes. And it's treated by this drug, or at least at the time, this drug, quinine, which is in tonic water. That's why it fluoresces if you put it under a black light. And the place that you get quinine at the time was this bark that mostly grew in Peru or Bolivia. And in the post-war period, where public sentiment was pretty anti the US-American War, the United States government, as well as the fledgling American Medical Association, reshifted public discourse to focus on these imports of Peruvian bark that was used to treat these soldiers. And they sort of said the reason so many people died was it was a low-quality product. It was adulterated. And this led to the passing of the 1848 Import Drug Act. And this is the first piece of federal legislation in the US that has anything to do really with drugs. And this says that we're going to search your drugs when you bring them to the United States, and we're going to make sure they're not adulterated. If they're adulterated, we're going to find you a bunch of money, and we're going to send it away. And this also allows the US to exert more and more control on the export and import of products mostly from Latin America. So here we are. That's the bill. We're going to move forward about 50 years. This is Harvey Wiley. He was a chemist. He was really interested in food and new food additives that were coming onto the scene as we have like this explosion of chemical ability to create new materials. And specifically, he created these groups called poison squads. These are volunteers, and later they were volunteers from his chemical bureau. And they came up with this motto for what they did: none but the brave can eat the fair. And that is accurate because the fair was chemically adulterated with borax, benzoic acid, sodium benzoate, copper sulfate, formaldehyde. And today, we know those all to be quite toxic. And you see recalls for food that have even small levels of this in them. But at the time, they were kind of new, and we didn't know whether or not they were going to be toxic. And these people ate them, and it turned out they were. And even despite pushback from industry, specifically the borax industry was like, no, eat our borax. It's really good for you. And they were like, no, it makes you sick. And they were right. It does make you sick. And this led to the passage of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. So it's mostly food that we're placing the emphasis on here. And drugs really get tagged on at the end, but this is really influential. It says that, if you're making a drug, you need to put what's in it, and you can't lie. If you lie, we're going to get you. That's sort of the legislative power that's given to the United States government at the time. Moving forward, we have the first antibiotic, sulfanilamide. This is a huge deal because for the first time we have the ability to treat gonorrhea. Soon we have penicillin, which treats syphilis, and sulfanilamide also treats strep. Now, the problem with treating strep with sulfanilamide is that, who gets strep a lot? Children. And what do children not like to do? A lot of things, but specifically take tablets or like big pills, and we couldn't dissolve sulfanilamide at the time, but we figured it out. So this is Dr. Archie Calhoun. He's posing with the first liquid preparation of it. It was raspberry flavored. And we figured out how to dissolve it with this sort of new novel, not really on the scene solvent, diethylene glycol. It happens to be very sweet as well. So seemed like a great idea at the time. And I want you to hold that in your mind just for a moment while we take a brief detour to talk about the burgeoning hormone production industry at the time. So this is Magnus Hirschfeld and his partner, Carl Geiss, and these are the hormones that they, I'm going to say hawked, but sold at the time. It's like powdered, freeze-dried bull testicle. And at the time, we weren't really sure how this was going to affect you. It was sold as something that could boost your virility, potentially extend your life, solve a lot of health conditions. And, this industry is still around today. This is from 2025, and it's, funnily enough, also freeze-dried powdered bull testicles. And today we see that as like kind of very clearly snake oil fake. But in Magnus Hirschfeld's time, it was not really clear how effective this was. And we had a lot of hope that these powdered extracts were the key to a lot of medical ailments. And specifically, insulin was a huge drug that influenced this. And we knew that it was going to be able to treat diabetes, which was a disease that was pretty much fatal at the time. But we were really held back by our ability to effectively purify it in a way that if we injected it, it wasn't just going to cause a huge allergic reaction. So we finally figured it out. And the way we produce it is by grinding up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of pig pancreases. And one pig only has one pancreas. So this is a lot of work. But we grind it up and we're able to extract the insulin. And for the first time ever, diabetics can live a life very similar to a non-diabetic. They don't die super young anymore. And soon we learned that, we don't even have to go straight to the pancreas. We can get them from animal excretions. First, we tried human excretions, so we got them from pregnant people. And then we learned we can actually get them from animals, which was way easier. And we later had some advancements in our chemical ability to synthesize from natural products. And by that, I mostly mean plants. So briefly, we start with extraction from organs, and even the transplantation of organs, then we move on to urine, and then natural products. And for some drugs like insulin, we ended up moving on to recombinant expression. It's not applicable to them all. Moving back to diethylene glycol, the really funny thing about that drug, not really that funny, is it's actually extremely poisonous. And at the time, you weren't required to test your drugs for efficacy or safety at the time, so they did not. They shipped this elixir throughout the United States, and because it was specifically geared towards children, led to a large number of deaths in the United States, which resulted in a lot of public outcry that was bolstered by calls from pharmaceutical companies as well as scientists to regulate this new category of pharmaceuticals that were seen as especially powerful and dangerous. This is the first time we can treat gonorrhea. This is the first time we can treat diabetes. And in a lot of ways, we were really concerned about young women, young Black men, and their ability to access these drugs without a prescription. And this led to the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as well as the Durham-Humphrey Amendment, which really fixed a lot of the loopholes in that original law. And so here we are. And this is how we run into our scene. We're in the 7-Eleven, and you actually, you can't get testosterone. But the question was, well, what about toothpaste? What about Tylenol? What about vitamins? It was unclear whether or not these things were also supposed to be something that we controlled through a prescription. And the group that was responsible for regulating this was the Federal Drug Administration, that was mostly run by a non-representative group of people that were making these large decisions that affected a lot of the United States as well as the rest of the world. And so under growing pressure from lobbyists from the grocer and other fields, we finally sort of shake out and, you can get your toothpaste, you can get your vitamins, and you can get your Tylenol, but you cannot, in fact, go to 7-Eleven and pick up testosterone today. And this really affected the landscape of what you can go to the store and buy without having to, move through a medical provider to get permission for. And this affects different people in different ways. And I want to focus specifically on pain medication, just as one example of many. We know that women with the same symptoms presentation are less likely to get pain medication. We know that Black people, racialized people in general, are less likely, way less likely to be prescribed pain medication. For instance, if you break your leg and you're white, you're way more likely to get opioids. Another conversation on whether or not we should change how we prescribe opioids, but we believe that certain people experience pain, and the medical society believes that some people experience it less than others. And also, trans people are way less likely to receive proper care in the emergency room. Moving very briefly on to the war on drugs, we have the establishment of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. This is like a level of legislation sort of on top of all of that FDA stuff, and it creates a scheduling system which no longer just regulates the manufacture and distribution of drugs, but also the possession and use or abuse of drugs by just people like us who are trying to use pharmaceuticals. And so testosterone specifically got regulated as a Schedule II drug, which means possessing it without a prescription, without that permission from a medical professional, is a crime, and it could cause you to end up in jail or otherwise criminalized. And we know that, especially in the United States, this affects different people far more than it does some. And I want to talk just briefly for a moment about Tylenol. So this is the history we've gone through. And as an example of how the decisions about what was going to be prescription and not, I want to compare Tylenol with testosterone. And that's not just because they both start with T. So Tylenol, the main active ingredient in it is acetaminophen, which is a pain reliever, an analgesic, and its area of therapeutic use, so the area that it's useful in the human body, and the area where it causes your liver to fail, you experience some hepatotoxicity, are actually really close to each other. And the problem is also that because it's non-prescription, there's all of these different products that are labeled very differently, say they treat different things, that their main ingredient is just acetaminophen. And if you combine two of them, you're in the toxic realm. And you're talking about a lot of, this is just America, a lot of problems that people run into because of this. So a lot of people end up in the emergency room, hospitalized, or dead each year. This is annual. And what about testosterone? It has some chronic problems. If you take it for a long time, it can have some health problems. But when you talk about acute toxicity, there really isn't any. And even the DEA, which isn't known for being pro-drug in any way, sort of says that, there's no known acute problems with testosterone. And because of this, there are some calls from both senators and scientists to reschedule or change the prescription status of acetaminophen. But I hope that helps your very, hopefully, surface level understanding of why you can't walk into 7-Eleven, why you can't get testosterone. And I want to invite you to imagine a world where you could, and whether or not you think that would be a good or a bad thing. And the reason that we're here today is really this complex relationship between a bunch of things that don't really have a lot to do with testosterone or pain medication. Yeah, so my main work is about autonomous trans healthcare. If you want to read my thesis, this is a chunk from the background on that. Go ahead and scan that, or please do email me with anything. My email is hello@transgender.digital. Thank you so much.